For me, one of the things that I think is invaluable about what we're doing is that it's not professional, but it's serious. And I think that line is very hard for some people to understand, that you can be serious and not be utterly professional. In fact, you guys are much more experienced and professional as having studied a lot more philosophy formally than I have. I have, an undergraduate background in political philosophy, but I think that the activity that we're doing, my conceit is that it's closer to the activity of engaging in philosophy than what you would often get a chance to do being a professional philosopher. There are very few people that get a chance to think it through.
And we're trying to master a different text every 3 weeks. Yes, if we wanted to spend a lot of time becoming, Flanagans on one particular topic, and we could do that, there's no doubt.
Or just get an expert to come and talk to us every time.
Yeah,
and then we don't have to
have
read
someone
anything.
who's very articulate, who's given the spiel many, many times before. But part of the point of the show is to hear us struggle with the text. And that's something that most professional philosophers wouldn't be willing to do, because as a professional, they're supposed to know and they're supposed to not make errors. And so the idea of openly confronting something new in public, struggling with it, and at times looking like a dumbass is alien to people who pride themselves on their professionalism. And that's one of the reasons why this show didn't exist until we came along and we're willing to do that.
We're unbelievably fucking brave. We're awesome.
It's true.
I would think that graduate students should be hearing this and saying, well, fuck, I could do that. And in fact, I'm more on top of things because I'm a graduate student now than these guys are. So I'll get 3 of my smart friends and do it. However, graduate students are probably too overworked, frankly.
Well, there's an awful lot of them that participate on the Facebook site.
I suppose.
I think a lot of them are.
Rise to the challenge. These guys need to come up and give us some competition.
Not everyone has Mark Linsenmeyer on their ass to
with sticking a poker up your butt to make sure you
make
do
sure
shit.
they do the reading, make sure they do the edit. I mean, it takes someone who's really on top of
It does take somebody who only sleeps 3 hours a night and has ADD to really drive one of these things, for sure.
Well, you might have noticed less blogging over the last week as I've been tired and working on other things. So with the new design, I'm sure you'll see more articles by each of the other podcasters as well as by our many wonderful guest bloggers.
Yes. I've actually been a little bit mad at myself because there have been a couple of good opportunities. If you guys paid any attention to this thing with Krauss and his book about saying philosophy is dead.
Yeah.
Little buzz thing going.
I know this is something that Wes has blogged on a few times of Stephen Hawking and other folks who, it seems like it's usually scientists and they're dissing primarily metaphysics, that if you're going to be figuring out what the nature of space and time are now, yeah, you do science. So philosophy has nothing to say about that. Well, we'll get to that. I mean, we already had the one on physics. There's plenty more that philosophers do have to say on that kind of thing. But it is timely to me as I'm starting to, even the stuff we read this week, which is not really ethics, it's meta-ethics, right? It's about the foundations of ethics, right? The question I had posed was, what's the relationship between facts and values? So it's an ontological question. It's a metaphysical question. What kind of stuff is there in your world that would allow values to be there, that would allow ethics to be possible? Some of the stuff that MacIntyre was saying, at least when we get a little farther into the book, as we will for next episode, had to do with that the problem is their metaphysical assumptions, that there was something in, he is a big Aristotle fan, which is why his book After Virtue has the picture of Athena on it, that every single book about classics has the same damn picture of Athena side view head with her big helmet on, leaning on a staff. In there, he cites Aristotle's Ethics and Politics as containing some insights that we've now lost in the modern age. And that's really his whole problem with what he considers the failure of ethics, including all the folks that we have read, the utilitarians and Kant's. He talks a little about Nietzsche as well, even though Nietzsche is also, like Aristotle, a virtue ethics guy. So he's sort of on the right track, but still there were things about Nietzsche himself is reacting to guys like Kant and Mill. And so if those guys made a mistake in rejecting this edifice that Aristotle created, which you really can't separate out his ethical thoughts, which all have to do with human potential, having a sort of correct way in which to grow. And that is what virtue is. You can't separate that from his metaphysical conceptions, from his views of what an organism is. So we're going to be reading some of that soon. It's gotten me in the mode of diving a little farther in some of our future episodes into some of these metaphysical issues. One could start a philosophy class talking about them, but I think it's much more difficult. When I was looking through Aristotle a little this week to prep for a couple episodes from now, there's a lot of stuff that just jumps out at you as being archaic, and isn't it great that we've progressed beyond this? So if you were approaching it like, let's do metaphysics first, you might think either we're just doing history. So, we don't care how wrong these pre-Socratics are. We're just going to, for scholarship purposes, figure out what they say. Or you just go right to the modern stuff, which is mostly science and not philosophy.
Was that the summary? Are we in the summary mode?
That was a transition.
I think that you have to be really careful about, especially for someone like Aristotle, of having a kind of simplistic knee-jerk reaction about things that he said that seem or are wrong in a particular way, and not pay attention to the way they relate to one another. There just are often a lot of cases where their mistakes are as fruitful as the things that seem right about it. And I think that you have to also, when you read original works of any sort, whether they're old or new, you have to come at them with a kind of generosity, because the fact is it's much easier to be a critic than it is to be somebody who's coming up with something on their own. If it's worth your time, it's worth trying to sort of sort out in itself.
Right. Even if it was just for historical purposes, Aristotle was so influential that, of course, you need to figure out his language in order to understand a lot of stuff that came after. So there's plenty of reasons, and we can get into when we actually talk about him.
I think we could also have a long discussion about what we mean by for historical purposes. I know that that's a big thread through things.
We don't just read Aristotle or the pre-Socratics for historical purposes. There are insights there, and there are still people willing to defend those insights.
Well, but even if it is history, and this is again on topic for MacIntyre. So MacIntyre has an approach that's a little like Foucault's that we read recently, who, remember, Foucault is actually following in the footsteps of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, that he's giving this history of the evolution of ethical concepts. When we set up this episode, his was the book we wanted to read, which is why we're doing a little bit of it this time. In the next episode, we're actually going to get to his positive account of how he thinks Aristotle can be revived for the modern world. But today is kind of the negative. And when we got into it, I felt like his method is very broad strokes, kind of like us discussing some of these figures, where he maybe pulls out a quote or two, but in one chapter is taking 3 or 4 figures and talking about the historical progression between them and sort of what that means for, in this case, the breakdown of traditional moral vocabularies and why things don't make sense now, why we're in the situation we are now where everything is driven toward relativism or nihilism or the kind of moral debates that we see now. So he, for one, sees going through the history as not only a part of diagnosing the problem like that, but also in coming up with the solution. So the second part of the book, he goes through Homeric virtues, and then virtues as Aristotle considered them and the other Greeks considered them, and then in the Middle Ages, and gets the whole picture out there, and seems to think that knowing that story then puts you in a great position to actually, it's not even just a matter of we can learn from the various insights that were sprinkled through the past to then come up with a good theory now, but a theory that disregards the history, that disregards the genesis, I think he thinks is a fundamental philosophical mistake. And that was the connection that we had mentioned between him and Wittgenstein, who was somebody he was very aware of.
And he thinks that the discussion of some of this history can tell us how and why some of these people were wrong. So, for instance, with More, for More's most fundamental argument, he just says it's obviously wrong and doesn't really give a philosophical argument.
Yes. So that forced us to have to put some of that into the syllabus here.
So either what he has to say in the second half of the book is so exciting, we should just skip what we read or perhaps we should explain why we read the first chapter of Principia, Ethica, and that ridiculous article by Stevenson in order to set up MacIntyre's sweeping and devastating critique of 20th century moral philosophy.
Maybe we could give a very brief overview of what we read in these 3 chapters of MacIntyre and then dovetail into more detailed conversations of the Stevenson and More readings.
I was thinking you could probably summarize the 2 articles pretty quickly before you did that, but
I want to get at why we were motivated to read those More and
okay. All right.
Stevenson articles, which is... So MacIntyre's argument is that there's this grave disorder in modern moral language, that basically we use moral language, but there's no substance to it. And he wants to give a history of why this is so. His big argument is going to be that something called emotivism has taken over and is culturally accepted and implicit in a lot of moral theories, even though the proponents of those theories don't realize it. The emotivist idea under MacIntyre's summary is just that evaluative expressions, including moral judgments, are not descriptive statements that have truth values. They're not about the world in any way. They're really prescriptive, or they're a way of endorsing something or saying, I like this and you should too, or not you should too, but more like an imperative. You like this too. So what's interesting is that he's going to trace this to G. Moore's notion that the good is this indefinable, non-natural property, which is sort of an extension of what we've discussed with Hume, where Moore's basic argument is that evaluative judgments, or our concept of the good, can't be reduced to any descriptive statements about the natural world, including, for instance, we can't just say that the good is the pleasant. So the way the pleasant is this natural term, or that the good is the welfare of the greatest number, as in utilitarianism or something like that. Moore gives an argument for that, which we'll discuss. But MacIntyre's idea is that because Moore's argument was generally accepted, people sort of lost faith that there was any legitimacy to moral language. So Moore is a moral realist. He believes that ethical judgments have truth values and that they say something about the world. But to some, his theory will seem to demand so much that we believe in these non-natural properties that we might just become skeptics altogether about moral language and say, well, it really isn't about the world, and moral judgments really don't have truth values. They're not descriptive. They're just about our preferences in some sense. And so that's the connection between Moore and emotivism that MacIntyre sketches.
It's called emotivism because, as Stevenson puts it, a moral statement is really an attempt to convince the other person to agree with your point of view about what is good. It's not about your intuition that a thing is good. It's that moral or ethical statements are intended to change other people's opinions or elicit reactions from them. And that's why you distinguish it from intuitionism.
Moral judgments are something like expressions of emotion, even though they're not exactly that.
Right. It's not just that I have an opinion about some matter of fact in the world and I'm trying to convince you of it, and so they're persuasive in that way. It's that they're not about something in the world at all. They're really about my own feelings about this, and I want to spread that to you. And so the closest, if we're going to translate this is good into something else, it's something like, we like this. But that's not going to capture it because why is that supposed to persuade me? So it's got this subtle emotional connotation. It's like anything you call good is going to sound nice. It's like calling something murder as opposed to killing, that murder has this evaluative component built into it. So the word good is different than saying I like it or we like it, in which case, well, fine, you like it. I don't give a crap. No, it's trying to snare you in as well.
So it would be a statement of value, but that has utterly no correspondence, I guess, with the world, or maybe better, it has only correspondence with your idiosyncratic opinion.
Or your feelings, yes. Opinion just still sounds like it could be an opinion about something, but it's not about anything. It's just an expression. So it's just like saying, yay.
But it's not enough for Stevenson that it be an expression of your particular preference. It's not a descriptive statement about, hey, I prefer this, or hey, this is what the group prefers. This is what society prefers. That would be to miss the character of the emotive that Stevenson is trying to get at. What's important is that it's prescriptive in some sense. It commends. So it says, I do like this, do so as well, or there's an imperative aspect to it. So it can't simply be, I'm describing my own preferences. It has to be more than that. It has to be an exhortation for you to like as well.
One thing that was interesting to me when I was reading Stevenson and Moore on this was that, at least in what we read, which, I mean, admittedly was a small piece of what they had written, neither of them took the next step down the road, which would be that all moral disagreements are fundamentally political.
Which is MacIntyre's conclusion of the way things are now, right? Because Moore's was really the logical consequent, I think, of all this previous thought, and yet the way that it was enacted, and Stevenson was actually a student of More's, that the negative story, why pleasure can't be good, why whatever the categorical imperative is can't accurately represent morality, those things, the negative things, More was on the money on, according to MacIntyre. But then when More actually tried to say positive things, he's just pulling it out of his ass. He's just using the worst kind of intuitionism, because that's all that's left. If you think that the good is just this undefinable thing that can't be argued for in terms of people's purposes or desires or anything like that, then it's just, well, when I sit back and I think about what I think is really good, well, this is what I come up with. And not surprisingly, people's opinions differ on that kind of thing. And the way that the students of More, according to MacIntyre, when they would lecture on this, it was very much they would use their own strong personalities to put forward what they thought was, in proceeding with More's project of actually spelling out what the good things are, now that More has done the work of defining the good, or rather saying it's indefinable, that they were emoting. So Stevenson was giving an accurate description of what More and his students were doing.
We should probably say at some point a little bit about this articulation of theory of meaning that More has. Because that, I think, rightly, MacIntyre points at as being underlying his account of ethics. And MacIntyre also dismisses it as being utterly fatuous.
Let's finish discussing Stevenson and then More, and then get into MacIntyre.
So can we say in a couple sentences that the nickel tour of Stevenson and the nickel tour of More?
More is chronologically first, and Stevenson actually accepts a lot of what More has to say in it. So let's do More first.
Okay.
So the Principia Ethica, 1903, hugely influential in Britain, America at the time for the first half of the 20th century. I owned the book from some philosophy class that I took, but it's not a standard thing like utilitarianism now that everybody has to read. But I think 1950 or before, certainly everybody would have had to slog through this. And it is a great paradigm example of what analytic philosophy looks like. That we had this discussion right before the Wittgenstein episode of we're getting back into reading the analytic guys, but then Wittgenstein himself is a terrible example of that sort of clarity and spelling everything out like it's a geometry text kind of thing that analytic philosophers do, that Wittgenstein is hopeless in that respect. He reads much more like at least the investigations, like Nietzsche, like giving these sort of aphorisms almost. So this one and the Stevenson really, though, if you want to know what analytic philosophy is about, take a look at this. This was the first one for me that I listened to it. Somebody had done a LibriVox recording. That's a podcast that you can get that people volunteer and they read books. So I actually listened to the whole book over the last few weeks, and it's read by some guy from the Middle East. So he has cute errors in pronunciation like ideal for ideal and prejudice for prejudice, and just they're all over the place. So if you've never heard some of the technical terminology before, it might make it a little more difficult. But in any case, it was one of those kind of things that I feel like audiobooks are for. The reason I use audiobooks like for novels or something is because it's something that kind of is long and sloggy, and I would probably just stop if I was just reading it. But because somebody else is reading it to me. And in fact, I did the first chunk of it, the first chapter here on normal speed, but then I felt like, no, I could go to double speed. So that everything was hyper fast too. So if it wasn't giving me a headache, it actually worked okay. MacIntyre characterizes More as having just famously bad arguments all over the place. And some of them are pretty miserable, but it seems like it's as good a place as any to jump into the ethical back and forth that is the outcome of the British moralists that we were talking about in the Human Smith episode. There's just this series of people that have these long books and they go through all the different virtues and patience and chastity and all that kind of stuff. And More responds to all these guys, but is focused on the meta-ethics part. So it's at least a little more cut and dried than that. So the bulk of his book is arguing against utilitarianism and things, but in detail, responding specifically to things that Sidgwick and other guys said. But all of the groundwork is all right here in chapter 1 that we all read. Some of chapter 1 is not so useful by itself, like the stuff at the end about the sum.
That would be completely not useful.
Yes, but he has a whole chapter later where he's talking about how now that we know that the parts are all good, can we say that the sum of the parts is good? And sort of doing this, how do you deal with
reading
part and hold and means
is absolutely excruciating.
You thought so?
If it doesn't drive you to the edge of suicide, then you should definitely apply to your analytic philosophy department.
I kind of liked it. I do think there are a lot of bad arguments in here, but at least they're more transparently bad than somebody like Wittgenstein, who you can't tell what he's trying to say. You know what Moore is trying to say at every step of the way, because he spells it out and then he reaches the end of the chapter and he spells it out again. And yet it's not so long like some of these that you just could never get through it.
This guy was the cat's meow for more than half a century, right? This book was.
Yep.
Okay. So when you say something like, it's clear that it's just full of these really terrible arguments, you're also saying that a laundry list of really wicked smart people bought them, right?
Yeah, I didn't see it as full of bad arguments.
Yeah, so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that part. For instance,
I have an example.
What's the difference between a really bad argument and one that you just don't agree with anymore?
Give your example, Mark, but I just want to say I didn't have that reaction of, oh, these are bad arguments. It's just, oh, this is just excruciatingly detailed and about things I just don't care about. That kind of reaction.
Well, here's the kind of thing that I had in mind, and it's not transparently bad, but given what else we've read, so this is page 2. We find that many ethical philosophers are disposed to accept as an adequate definition of ethics the statement that it deals with the question of what is good or bad in human conduct. They hold that its inquiries are properly confined to conduct or to practice. They hold that the name practical philosophy covers all the matter which has to do. Next paragraph, ethics is undoubtedly concerned with what the question of good conduct is, but being concerned with this, it obviously does not start at the beginning, unless it is prepared to tell us what is good as well as what is conduct. For good conduct is a complex notion. All conduct is not good, for some is certainly bad and some may be indifferent. And on the other hand, other things besides conduct may be good, and if they are so, then good denotes some property that is common to them and conduct. And if we examine good conduct alone of all good things, then we shall be in danger of mistaking for this property some property which is not shared by those other things. What is your reaction before I tell you what seems transparently wrong about that to me?
He continues on. He says, this is a mistake which many writers have actually made. I find it just pompous bullshit. Every philosopher through the ages goes around saying, well, they really don't understand what they're saying. I mean, this is the same argument that Socrates makes, And in that way, it's tiresome. And the fact that you would have a whole section of your book saying, well, it's really because they don't really understand their terms and they make this mistake all the time. And now because I'm such a smart guy and I really know what's going on, that I'm not going to make that mistake. It's both a tired technique to me and one that doesn't seem to really take me as a reader seriously.
But it's not just a pompous introduction. He is established right there, he thinks, in those 2 sentences, that consequentialism is the way to approach ethics. And the way we had presented ethics in our earlier podcast is some people doing ethics are consequentialists. They start with what the good is. Some are deontologists. They start with what the right is. Some are virtue ethicists. They start with virtue. He's just saying, look, obviously, because good conduct is a compound noun,
yes,
then obviously good and conduct are not the same thing. He's pointing at a verbal thing and saying that indicates directly what the root of the matter is. And he then uses that as a bedrock principle for a whole chapter later. He dismisses rule-based approaches because obviously the best rules are going to be the ones that'll produce the best outcomes most of the time. But since we can't know all the circumstances, they're at best going to be probabilistic. So anything like Kant's ethics is just out the window. Likewise, virtues. Virtue is really just whatever it is, the qualities that make us more likely to produce the most good. Those are all definitional, even though he takes himself to look how careful I'm being. I'm parsing all of the notions here. And yet he just makes this stupid mistake, which, maybe this is just historical hindsight. The fact that we read the Saussure and things and say, oh, well, maybe in our language, good conduct is 2 words, but maybe in another language, it's just jeu. It's just one thing. And actually parsing them apart, you wouldn't talk about ice cream as also being good. You would call it something else. Good conduct is moral goodness, and that is a single irreducible term.
Not that I want to jump ahead, but MacIntyre at least makes the effort to explain why this had such an impact. Page 16 of After Virtue. This is great silliness, of course, and he's talking about Moore's argument for good being indefinable, but it is the great silliness of highly intelligent and perceptive people. It is therefore worth asking if we can discern any clues as to why they accepted More's naive and complacent apocalypticism. One suggests itself. It is that the group who were to become Bloomsbury had already accepted the values of More's 6th chapter, but could not accept these as merely their own personal preferences. They felt the need to find objective and impersonal justification for rejecting all claims except those of personal intercourse and of those of the beautiful. MacIntyre, prior to this, talks about the prioritization of the aesthetic at some point, so that's what he's referring to there. He says, what specifically were they rejecting? Not, in fact, the doctrines of Plato or St. Paul or any of the other great names in Wolff's or Strachey's Catalogue of Deliverance, but those names as symbols of the culture of the late 19th century. So what he's basically saying is More provided a justification and maybe an articulation of something that was in the air at the time, which was a desire to break from a certain kind of tradition, whatever that tradition was, the Enlightenment, the classical tradition, what have you, and proclaim a new era that fit their cultural and aesthetic model. MacIntyre is saying that because, of course, he's going to later argue that you can't divorce the language of morality from historical context. And so this movement really set the stage for this 20th century abuse and misuse of terms, the language of morality, sort of abstracted from context. So we've talked about it numerous times on this podcast, where we read, what are they called, neologisms of these philosophers making ridiculous claims about other races and bile. If we read Galen today, right, we'd all be laughing hysterically, I suppose. But it's indicative of something in the historical context, and that's the point that MacIntyre wants to make about it.
Well, there is an argument that is still taken seriously, and that is his naturalistic fallacy and open question argument. We get a little bit of it in that first chapter, I think. More is not just an anachronism, and I think it bothers me that MacIntyre doesn't really argue against More and just dismisses him, because it's an argument that was taken very seriously and argued about in great detail, and it's not so easy to dismiss, I think.
There's some important ways, it seems to me, that MacIntyre, at least practically, agrees with More.
Should we give a little summary of what More's naturalistic fallacy thing?
Have we clearly stated what More's position is?
Let's do that.
So the good is indefinable, right?
Well, let's not just say the good is indefinable, because that's kind of a consequence, I think.
Oh, okay.
I mean, More's idea is that in the tradition of ethics, people have been trying to define the good in terms of some sort of natural quality, say pleasant or the greatest happiness for the greatest number or something like that. And his idea is that that's a fallacy. So, for instance, even if it were true that all pleasant things are good, that doesn't mean that the properties of good and pleasant are identical to each other. That's the fallacy. He thinks that they can't be identical because anytime you grant something that these properties, let's say, are coextensive, that you found something where in every case, anything that is pleasant is also good. And you can still wonder whether being pleasant is the same thing as being good. You could still question that. And that questioning wouldn't mean that you're just simply incompetent with the concepts. That's a crucial step, meaning I can know how to use good and I can know how to use the word pleasant and still wonder if they're the same thing.
I think it's important to say why he wants to cast this as a theory of the meaning of the word good, because the counter that everybody gives is, what if it's not a theory of meaning? What if it's about the nature of the good? But the people that he's reacting to, like Mill, did consider that the way we use the good in normal speech might be a little confused, but the project of Mill and many others was to systematize our common sense. Right. So both Mill and Kant at the end of the day said, all I'm really expressing is just what common sense tells us. It's just that common sense doesn't think in this sophisticated and universal way. And now that we've codified it, now that we can clean up the imperfections. So it really was supposed to be getting at the underlying linguistic meaning of what good or right is. It's just that, again, it's a corrective meaning. It's not just saying what the many think about it. It's improving upon it.
Right. It's a conceptual analysis, let's say.
Yes. So that's very different than what, say, a scientist is doing. Like, what is water really? I'm going to examine it and find the molecular structure. And that's never been what philosophers have been trying to do with the good. It's always been some kind of conceptual analysis. Because it's our concept. We use it. We I don't know what the correlation is for water. I mean, you could say like, what is the essence of, like the commercial, the essence of shaving? What is the essence of water? It's cool and refreshing. And you could write a poem to express the essence of water. In that sense, you'd be a conceptual analysis of water, but it's so obvious that that's different than what the scientist is doing.
Yeah. So Moore's basic idea is that if the good and, let's say, the pleasant or any other natural property you want to choose were the same thing, it would be obvious. It would be obvious through conceptual analysis, and it wouldn't be a point of dispute. Just the fact that it can be a point of dispute suggests that there, in fact, is no identity.
And that turns on him categorizing what this term good means in his theory of meaning. It ends up being a term that is just different than other kinds of. It's a class of terms that don't have natural correlates, but also have a different relation to their parts.
Actually, he says it's a concept, not a term.
Okay.
Your point is still taken.
So you're saying the various ethical concepts have a relationship to each other. That's the part whole. But it seems the good itself, not referring to the number of individual things that are good, but the good is simple. It doesn't really have parts, right?
I think you're right. I was just trying to make the point that underlying his analysis of the good is a meta-analysis of the good as an example of a kind of concept, not a term, I guess. That there's a kind of semiotic analysis going on for him.
So the idea is that you can't analyze the good into a natural predicate or a number of natural predicates, and that it itself is non-natural, right? Good is not a property like yellow that we find out there.
Actually, that's exactly
it is like yellow.
Says.
Yes, it is like yellow in its. It is like yellow in its simplicity and its unanalyzability, but it's not like yellow in being natural. So.
Yeah, it's a non-natural simple.
Okay, a non-natural simple, yes. And by simple, it just means there's nothing else to which you could make recourse to explain it to somebody else. I mean, that's kind of the gist of what he's saying, is that you can't explain yellow to somebody. They just have to know what yellow is.
Yeah.
But the key there, right, is that yellow or chocolate or other simples have sensory correlates that you can appeal to a kind of pointing. He doesn't say it this way, but you can appeal to a kind of pointing that would be characteristic of natural science and say, well, look, this is what I mean by yellow, and hold an example out, and everybody can stand around and look at it. And you might have some discussion of the subtleties involved, but you all basically know what you're talking about. And I think he means that to be the case with the good, except it is absent this characteristic of it being natural.
So analysis comes to an end somewhere, right? We could take any object or more complex property and try and break it down into its simplest parts. But at some point, we're going to have these basic elements, and they're sort of what's given, in the philosophical tradition is called the given, that at some point we have data that's given to us and, through sensory experience and possibly in other ways. Sensory experience is the paradigmatic example. And these are just simple things, and everything that's complex is built out of them.
What occurs to me about this is thinking about a kind of paradigmatic example of elements in Euclid, where you have simples in their definition, like, I think the first one is a point is that which has no part. There are a number of other definitions in which it's not at all clear that you are appealing to genuine sensory perception the way you might be with yellow, but you are indeed abstracting from that, and that it has some reflection or correspondence to the measuring of the world and lines and things like that. But in the end, these triangles and these lines, they're ideal in some way. They're no longer being analyzed in terms of a drawn triangle or a curve or a line in the world, but they're being analyzed based upon their definitions that you've given them. And so he doesn't talk about it this way.
Right.
The good could be like that, right?
Right. No, and I think he thinks it is like, so this points to the idea that we can have intuitions of things, which there's not merely sensory intuition, but there are other sorts of intuition. In our Kant episodes, we talked about this. And the idea is that mathematics is a case in which we have these abstract intuitions of form. So if anything, the moral intuitions would be, in a sense, they'd be more like these abstract intuitions. You see something that's happening that's wrong, let's say. Someone's unjustly beating another person or something like that. And the idea is that there's an intuition, you're aware of something in the object that's bad. And presumably there's some sort of faculty for that. And your relationship is intuition. And it's on analogy to sensory intuition. So I can see what's happening. Light is coming in through my eyes and all that sort of thing. That's the sensory intuition part of it. But at some other level, maybe an intellectual level, or it's hard to say, there's a moral intuition of the badness of what's happening. And the badness is out there. Just like yellow is out there in some sense, so is badness.
He does specifically say what makes it a non-natural property is it in space and time or not?
Yeah, that's why I said it's a tricky situation, because I want to say out there, but of course it's not spatially out there. But
Right. If there's a God, then that would be something non-natural. It exists beyond space and time. But also numbers, all the mathematical objects you were talking about, really all the stuff that we talked about in our Frege episode, although I didn't see in more him talking about, say, abstract propositions or something like that, or senses like Frege does, but even though he was friends with Russell and was very aware of all that stuff that was going on. So talking about an ideal non-natural realm in this sense was not particularly anti-scientific, I think, for people of his day.
Not at all. In some ways, it's in league with positivism and verificationism because, well, that gets complicated.
The parallel that I saw was with the early Wittgenstein, in that example that I read about good and conduct are basics, and then you combine them into this complex, that it's that notion of atomic propositions or atomic things building to molecular concepts. That's what I'm seeing there. That's why we can talk about morality, the good, as being a simple,
right? Because
that's something that then gets built up into these other things. And actually, I like, Dylan, that you made a reference to the part at the end of this chapter that we had already dismissed as being useless, that actually one of the interesting syntactic facts about the good, what makes it unlike a natural property, is that the part-whole relations with the good don't work as you would expect. That it's not just this is good and this is good, so putting them together makes a better, is the sum of the two goods. It could be that putting them together makes a bad situation. Having two entertainers in the same show with completely opposed styles that end up undermining each other or something like that, or two musicians playing at the same time that ruin each other, that's just not how value works, but that is how things in the natural world would work.
Yeah, certainly they're not magnitudes of the same sort where you would add them together and get just more of the same.
Right. He uses that later in the book for things like to consider those arguments about theodicy, like we need some evil in the world to have the best possible world, right? Because if there's no evil in the world, people couldn't be brave and strong in the face of evil. And he argues against that no, it could be in the actual world that kind of stuff does bring about a good overall situation because the goodness of the virtues would outbalance the other things. But still, on the whole, it would be a better world if the bad things did not happen in the first place. He uses that kind of reasoning as a direct outgrowth of these comments about part-whole relationships.
For Moore, it is. He's a moral realist, meaning that moral judgments do have truth values and they are about the world in some sense, just not the natural world.
Yeah, just like we were saying, numbers are non-natural, right. But yet there are 3 pencils here. They are realized in the world. So the good really is realized in the world. It does have a referent.
Well, but in the case of the pencils, the 3 is with respect to a whole that you have selected as being the whole. And so the only way in which it's 3 is that you've decided that the pencil is the whole. If you're going to speak about the numbers themselves, then you just abstract away from pencil and you speak of a one thing. And once you have a one, then you can have a many. And there are always a many of the same sorts of ones that always add up together. They always can be combined. But if you have ones that are not of the same sort, then you can't even combine them. You can't combine a mass with a distance. They're not magnitudes of the same kind.
This is just getting at that old argument that we've had, empiricism versus rationalism. And could you get the concept of numbers just by counting objects and abstracting from that? And there's a strong tradition. I usually take the empiricist side on this, incidentally, but with Frege and Kant and others saying that no, that might be the way that we learn these notions, but that isn't sufficient to define the concept, something like that. Yes. Yeah. That there's an intuition that gives us these mathematical things.
Yeah, a number must in some sense be a real object, and our mathematical propositions have truth values and they're about something real.
Because maybe we've never counted up past some certain amount, or we've certainly never seen a set of objects. It's 4 million objects and counted them, and that's how I know 4 million. So at some point,
I could write down a number that's larger than the number of particles in the universe.
Yes. So we did not get that from experience. There's plenty of empiricist responses for it. That's not the point right now. But you might say, well, what if we're mistaken? That I see some set of 3 pencils, but it really ends up, there's 4 pencils, there's one hidden behind it. We don't say that corrects something about the number. We just say, I saw it wrong. And I think he would say the same thing about the good, that in any concrete circumstance, maybe we're misunderstanding something. So what we're grasping when we intellectually intuit what the good is something a little more abstract than that for them. Maybe we're getting at some abstract principles of, what justice is. But then when we look at any given circumstance, maybe I see something that looks like it's an act of injustice, but I just don't have all the facts and it's really not.
We say that he's a realist, that Moore is a realist about ethics. We're saying that he's something like a mathematician, that he believes that there are actually numbers in the world, that numbers are real, that they're not merely abstractions from empirical data. And therefore, you can have a discussion about them. The problem is going to be, of course, that how is it that you stand around and look at the same thing together to have that discussion? And at the end, it seems like that's where the whole emotivism argument comes in, where it descends into persuasion.
What do you mean? How do you look at the same thing together?
This is the same problem as the naturalism argument. If it's natural, then there is a way in which you can stand around and look at yellow and everybody can point to it and they can say, well, that's yellow, and you can formulate conventions and rules.
Well, there's a sense in which you can do that with math as well, right? It's just the concept of objectivity, and you get that with math. And
yes, so why does that fail with value in Moore's case?
Moore is like those other moral sense people, when we were talking about Hume and Smith in this regard, that ultimately the clear-headed person who thinks about this thing, they'll all be able to agree. And if they don't agree, that's fine, but they can argue about it. And the argument can be productive. You can show me the error of my ways. That's at least, you could call it a faith, but it's sort of the presupposition of the project. So at the end...
Well, MacIntyre's going to say that that's empty at the end of the day for that.
Right.
Yeah, that version of it's empty.
When Flanagan was talking about this, when I brought this up in the Flanagan episode, he said, well, look, when you get to chapter 6 of Principia Ethica and he starts actually giving his positive account of morality, it's just so obviously his preferences. And I saw that too, when I was listening to that he talks about chastity or lust, the way he describes lust as a desire for an evil thing or something very obviously, where did you pull this out of? Oh, your, Victorian sense of morality. That's clearly. But he himself at the end of the chapter says, look, I've just given these sort of sample readings just to kind of get the project in motion. I could be wrong about all of this. What's important is the metaethical stuff that I've said here. And now you are set on the road to having these intelligent discussions about what the good is. Go to it, which seems actually a lot more like what Flanagan was recommending and what MacIntyre, I think, is recommending.
Sure.
The point I wanted to get at is that his argument isn't as easily dismissible as MacIntyre makes it out to be. MacIntyre doesn't really air an objection against it, and the objections that can be aired against it, I don't know if we want to go into those, but they're still contended, today. There's still discussion about whether or not Moore's open question argument and moral non-naturalism actually works or not.
Give the big objection.
So the big objection is that Moore seems to be saying that if two things don't have the same meaning, then they can't refer to the same property. But we can find a counterexample to that pretty easily. So in the case of water and H2O, those two terms have different meanings, and yet they're identical. So we can say something is water if and only if it's H2O. You could say, well, it's an open question whether or not water is H2O, because, for a long time we didn't know that water was H2O, and then we discovered that. And that doesn't mean that they're not identical. Of course, they are identical. So that's a counterexample where there's an open question and yet two properties that are identical.
Yeah, and I should say in Pat Churchland's Brain Trust that we spoke with her about in an episode, she has a very brief bit on more, and she gives exactly that same kind of thing. Like, well, why would you possibly think? We don't think that intuition should counter the identities discovered by science. That's just silly. Why are you talking about using this as a theory of meaning at all? It's supposed to be getting at the nature of the good, not at the meaning of the good.
Right. Which surprised me because there's a very strong response to that objection. And the fact that Churchland didn't acknowledge that was kind of surprising. I mean, I've
got a quote, since we didn't get in this with her and I didn't have you on. I know you've thought this was an especially weak part of Churchland's book. This is page 189 here. Had Moore merely pointed out that the relationship between our nature and what is good is complex, not simple, he would have been on firmer ground. Analogously, the relationship between our nature and health is complex. As with morals and values, no simple formula will suffice. Because one cannot simply equate health with, for instance, low blood pressure or getting enough sleep, a moron health might argue that health is a non-natural property, unanalyzable and metaphysically autonomous. Using science to help figure out what we ought to do to be healthy will, on this Morean view, be unrewarding, since it is an ought project, a normative, not a factual project. Such a view seems peculiar.
It's a truly obnoxious misreading of Moore and uncharitable, and just she doesn't comprehend there what Moore is actually saying.
Say a little bit more about why she's misunderstanding about Moore, because the notion of health seems to me to be very analogous to the notion of good. And her claim about the notion that, well, health is not analyzable into one of these individual physical processes, that's true. It seems to be not a simple in some ways, but it has natural characteristics.
Moore's argument is that you can identify the good or an evaluative property with any natural property you like, but then it's still an open question for semantically competent speakers about whether or not that property is good. That's a pretty compelling argument that's hard to overcome, and that really your best shot at overcoming it, I think, is the H2O example. But like I said, I don't know if we want to go into it, but there's a strong response to the H2O example. I mean, if Churchland had simply acknowledged that there's continued argument on whether the H2O counterexample works.
If you're going to bring it up, then might as well explain it.
The idea is that in the case of H2O being identical to water, water is a concept that we can say a lot about before we ever realize that it's H2O. We know it's colorless. We know it's a liquid. We know it fills oceans. We can't really say a lot about the concept of good. That's the problem.
Is that really true? That we can't say a lot about the concept of good?
We can't say a lot about what governs our use of the concept good. And what governs our use of the concept water, we know that there's this colorless stuff that fills oceans, blah, blah, blah. That, on some level, governs our use of the concept. For water, it's non-controversial. There isn't a non-controversial definition of good that we all agree on that we can say a lot about before we get to the question of some underlying property that grounds good.
Is that any different than saying that water is a natural thing, that we could all stand around and point at it and then agree that, well, yeah, we're all talking about water. This is what we mean by it. And therefore, the constraint is just outside of ourselves in some way, that the good is not outside of ourselves.
Well, whether it's outside of it, I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, that's one theory of why it's so.
The water is plainly outside of ourselves in a way that the good is not plainly outside of ourselves.
We do, I think, have an ostensive parallel to all pointing at the watery stuff that we don't know the chemical property of yet, which is the paradigm cases of good, that pre-philosophically, we have this reservoir of common sense, which again is Moore's end project to systematize, just like all these other guys. So we do have the platitudes.
The point is that there's disagreement. I look at the cake and say it's good. You look at the cake and say it's bad. There's never that kind of situation with water. And so our pre-conceptual activities are actually in discord. And that's the problem. When you go on to discover that the stuff that governs our use of the concept water actually is H2O, there's a sense in which the is water H2O question becomes closed. But with our use of good, once we realize that in our culture, let's say, good is regulated by some natural property N, say pleasantness, say in this society, the pleasant is the good. We could still ask whether or not the pleasant is the good. It would still be an open question. That's because we can say that the whole society is wrong about this, that we live in this morally compromised society that believes that the good and the pleasant are the same when they're really not. But we can't really do that with water because, again, we have that robust description of the concept pre-theoretically before we ever get to H2O.
Just thinking about water, it would be the case that if someone were to point to iron and say, well, that's water, and start talking about iron and its properties, two things would happen. One is we would have a discussion about the way in which they were wrong about calling the iron water. They were just confused, and we would have some criteria about the way in which they were confused. And if they continued to insist on it, then we would say they were just delusional.
Yeah. For whatever reason, they would have a language problem. They wouldn't be good users of the concepts. But in the case of moral disagreements, we don't say, oh, you just don't know what good means.
It might be a separate discussion about whether or not when people are certain about the good, that they don't have that kind of pointing towards events or circumstances and say, well, that's clearly good and that one's clearly bad. Yeah. In a way that's akin to pointing towards water and saying that's clearly water and this is iron and it's clearly not water.
This is something that MacIntyre is going to pick up on in his positive case, that within a given community, if you have these values more or less set out, so that it is very much like that, so that if you think murder is great in most communities, you're insane.
Well, I mean, you see this in political conflicts. I mean, just the difference between individual states in the United States, where in some places, castle doctrines and shooting people who just happen to be on your property that you don't want to be there is okay, and in other places it's not. And that is, well, it's a law, and it forms a kind of normative structure for that community. And in most of those cases, it's somehow reflecting some kind of average disposition of that community.
Yeah.
And you would easily just point and say, well, that's clearly wrong, and that's based upon that.
But there are moral disagreements within communities, and they're much more prevalent than having someone who's delusional or doesn't know what water means when they're an adult. Mm-hmm. And especially between communities. In the case of good, right, we just have good. We don't have this clear definition the way we do with water, or this clear liquid and all that stuff. So the identity that's being predicated is between H2O and all these other properties, liquid, clear, so on and so forth, or the thing that has all those properties. Say that good were obvious in the sense that it were silvery, in the same way that water is liquid and clear. So then the predication of identity there, if we discovered that the good is the pleasant, would be this silvery stuff is what's pleasant. And that's where the identity is being predicated. And we say, oh, before we thought this silvery stuff governs our use of the word good, but now we realize that the silvery stuff is what's pleasant. That's where you would get an analogous case to the idea of discovering that H2O is the same thing as water. In this case of the good, there is no analogous case because we don't have this obvious set of properties that we suddenly find out that pleasantness is correlated to.
My response is this whole notion of obvious, which it seems to me boils down to Moore's objection of natural versus non-natural. So he wants to consider the good a non-natural simple. And water would be an example of a natural simple.
No, water is not a simple.
Bracket the question of it being simple. The important point there is that it's natural in a way that the good is not natural. That is what is entailed in what you're saying as being, there's not the obvious things. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to that the natural involves a kind of ostension. And maybe it's as much as that there's just more general agreement about it, that it's just much easier to have a bunch of people, saying again, stand around and point at it and say, well, yeah, that's what's going on. And entailed in that is going to be a kind of repetition, that the kind of experience that these people have individually with water is going to be repeatable for them in the same way that it is repeatable for everybody else. And so that they then agree, so that the landscape of possibility is just not as broad as it is for the good. Now, the question that I would have is then, well, why is that the case? What is it about the good that admits of that kind of multiplicity? And part of that's going to be that there's something about the good as a value that resides within a person in a way the judgment about water and its characteristics, even if it that judgment relies in the person, that it is pointed to something outside of themselves in a much more decisive way than it is with respect to the good.
Yeah, that's a good segue into emotivism, because that's the emotivist will come along and say, well, in fact, these predicates like good aren't really referring to these non-natural properties in the world. That's a kind of bizarre notion when you think about it, right? It seems forced by Moore's argument, but it's bizarre enough that someone might just want to say, okay, if naturalism really is no longer a live option, and what's required for moral realism is that we embrace these non-natural properties, then maybe we should just forget about moral realism altogether and forget about non-natural properties and say that, no, moral judgments don't have truth values and they're really about endorsement and so on and so forth.
The wrap-up on Moore is a quick quote. But yellow and good, we say, are not complex. They are notions of that simple kind out of which definitions are composed and with which the power of further defining ceases. So I read him in the essay as talking about concepts and not necessarily terms. So first question is, of course, whether those two things are distinct or the same, but that he needs a conceptual scheme. He needs some idea of the way we conceive of things that has simples and complexes. We kind of threw off that, and we blew off the second half of the essay about the composition of complexes. But starting right there, that would be step one in trying to justify it in my eyes, would be to say there are simple concepts and there are complex concepts, and simple concepts are irreducible. And I thought that that was something that basically got debunked as part of the whole primary, secondary qualities discussion back in the day. And I don't know that anybody would seriously try to defend the idea that there are simple, irreducible concepts. I would expect if I was to read Principia Ethica further, that would be some of the heavy lifting he would have to do.
Yes. And recall in our discussion with Flanagan, he kind of dismissed this whole thing also. Well, we don't ask for definitions anymore in philosophy. So the whole thing he was arguing against and the position he was put into is sort of all moot. That seems just as dismissive as Churchland's quote there. But the point is well taken based on what I thought was legitimate out of Wittgenstein last time. So Stevenson was at Cambridge a student of Moore's and a student of Wittgenstein's. So even though this was written before the investigations came out, he took classes with Wittgenstein when he was thinking about some of this stuff and lecturing on some of this stuff. So we were talking a minute ago about, well, what if we had for the good some cases of ostension that we all point to the murders and say those are bad, and we can, at least within a given culture, maybe even universally, there might be things we can point out with that. But I remember Churchland saying in our discussion with her that, well, that doesn't give you much. You can't build that into a whole theory just based on those obvious cases that torturing orphans maliciously for